Hey guys, it's Chris. From the survivor of a brutal plane crash to a guy lost in the desert who survived off bat blood, here are 10 of the luckiest people on Earth who survived the impossible. Number 10. Sawblade through the engine. A man in China is extremely lucky after a giant saw blade crashed through his car but didn't kill him. According to ABC News, this happened while the man was driving down the highway. He was on the expressway in central China when the blade from an enormous circular saw fell off the back of a truck that had been carrying heavy equipment in the lane right next to him. The saw fell off the truck and sliced through his hood. Miraculously, this guy walked away without a single scratch. He claims that he heard a bang, and then he saw nothing but white smoke. But he did manage to get control of his car and pull over. While this guy is definitely one of the luckiest people ever, the police did say that if he'd been driving faster or if the blade had hit from just a slightly different angle, could have died on the spot. For example, if the blade had been sideways and smashed through his windshield instead of his hood, the result would have been something out of a bloody horror movie. As for the neglectful driver of the truck carrying heavy equipment, hopefully he got fired. Could you imagine? This looks like something straight out of a nightmare, but somehow the man survived, and he probably loves his life today. Number 9. The luckiest and unluckiest man alive. Frank Selak has been labeled the luckiest and unluckiest man in the world. And you may have heard of him before. He apparently won the jackpot in 2002, and he also claims to have had 7 brushes with death throughout his life. However, there have been some serious doubts as to how true his stories are. First of all, he allegedly survived a plane crash in 1963 while flying from Zagreb to Rijeka. As if that wasn't unbelievable enough already, he also claims that he survived a train derailment the year before, and in 1966 he apparently survived a bus that crashed into a river. He also says that in 1970 and 1973, he survived 2 car accidents in which his car spontaneously caught fire. He even got hit by a bus in 1995. Then in 2002, he won the lottery. Obviously, this would be the most incredible story ever, if not for the fact that we have instant access to all the information we could ever want. After doing some digging, it turns out there was no Croatian plane crash in 1963, and there was no fatal train derailment the year before. While it is possible that these things happened but were never reported, it does seem seriously unlikely. Frank Selak could have had some brushes with death in his lifetime, but as for him surviving a train crash, plane crash, and bus crash, well, the jury's still out. If I were the jury, though, I would pronounce this man a total fraudster and con artist. He sounds like maybe a bit of a habitual liar. Number 8. Tornado survivor. Tornadoes are a real force of nature. Most people don't get hit by a tornado and live to tell the tale. In fact, most people who get swept up in a vicious twister, well, they end up dead. But a guy named Matt Suter survived not only being swallowed by a tornado, but being thrown clear across a field. It all happened when Matt was pulled out of his house by a tornado in the middle of March, and then deposited a quarter of a mile away in a pasture. According to one tornado expert, this is the only person who has ever traveled so far inside of a twister and lived to tell about it. According to the young man himself, a senior at Fordland High School, it's a pretty awkward record to have. On the night of the tornado, Matt had been watching TV in his boxer shorts when he heard a sudden roar approaching the trailer where he lived with his grandmother. While trying to shut a window in the living room, the tornado sucked him outside. The distance he was thrown by the tornado was about 1,307 feet. He woke up in the field completely disoriented and could see the lights of his trailer shining in the distance. What's even more amazing about this story is that other than some badly bruised feet and a small cut on his head, he was absolutely fine. You might even say he's one of the luckiest people on Earth. What's the most vicious weather event or natural disaster you've ever experienced? Were you ever in a hurricane or near a tornado or an earthquake? Or if you're really unlucky, maybe a volcanic eruption? Or was it just a rough thunderstorm for you? Let me know your scariest experience with Mother Nature by writing a comment down below. Then be sure to subscribe to World List for more incredible videos just like this one. Number 7. Plane crash survivor. Surviving a plane crash is pretty much impossible. However, when LaMia Flight 2933 crashed in 2016, a man named Erwin Tumiri survived. It was a literal miracle. 71 people died when the plane smashed into the Colombian mountains, but Erwin survived apparently by getting into the fetal position and putting luggage between his legs while everyone else got up and ran around the airplane screaming. He actually followed the guidelines that a person should follow in an emergency, trying to create as much cushioning around himself as possible and also protecting his head. He was one of 6 survivors, all of whom were extremely lucky. Another thing that made their escape possible was that the plane had very little fuel, so even when it crashed into the mountain and was ripped into 1,000 pieces, it didn't explode. 6 of the passengers managed to escape, and the other 71 sadly died on impact. Number 6. Undersea rescue. A Nigerian man survived the unthinkable. 2 full days submerged under the ocean, trapped inside a small air pocket. Harrison O'Keene was on a tugboat when it capsized during a heavy swell and sank to the seabed. But it sank upside down. Mr. Harrison somehow managed to get stuck inside of a very small air pocket, and he spent 2 full days at the bottom of the ocean with nothing to eat or drink, sitting in total darkness. The other 12 people on board, they all died, and Mr. Harrison was the only survivor. He sat inside the boat for 60 hours until a team of divers showed up and rescued him. Of course, they were extremely shocked to find someone alive inside of the wreckage, and they almost missed him. Mr. Harrison had to grab one of the divers as he passed by him, otherwise they would have just left him there completely unaware of his situation. After spending the rest of the day inside a decompression chamber to normalize his body pressure, Mr. Harrison was finally out of the ocean. This is honestly one of the most miraculous stories you'll probably ever hear, and it's likely Mr. Harrison will never get on another boat again. At least I'm sure I wouldn't if I were him. Number 5. 16 bullets. This next story is a true anomaly. Typically, if you get shot, you're gonna die. That's just the way it goes, and that's the way guns were designed. But one guy survived the impossible when he was shot 16 times and then proceeded to walk 2 miles to the hospital. Philadelphia police are still calling it a miracle. The police department spokesman told CNN that the man was shot 5 times on his right side, 2 times on his left hip, 3 times in his upper chest, once in his right shoulder, once in the right side of his neck, 3 times on his left forearm, and once in his right forearm. This guy was literally filled with lead, and even after being shot 16 times, he was still expected to survive. Police say they aren't sure why he was shot so many times, and they have no idea how he managed to walk himself to the hospital. They also don't have any idea how he could possibly still be alive, but nonetheless, he's gonna walk away no worse for wear, and with a truly remarkable story to tell. Number 4. Swallowed by a whale. How would you like to be swallowed by a whale? You probably wouldn't like it at all. I know I wouldn't. And neither did the South African diver who got swallowed by a whale and miraculously survived. It all happened when a bride's whale appeared out of nowhere and began to swallow everything in its path. According to the diver himself, he felt a sudden pressure around his waist and immediately understood he was being eaten. You can see the whole thing in a video uploaded to YouTube, which has since garnered millions of views. The whale literally swallowed this guy, and you can see the last second in which his head is just outside of the whale's mouth, and the rest of his body has been eaten. But even though this guy should have died, the whale seemed to realize its error. It opened its mouth and spat him out, much to the diver's appreciation. Isn't that insane? A real-life version of the biblical Jonah and the whale story. Number 3. Bat blood and human urine. Getting lost in the desert is the last thing anyone really wants to do. It's hot, it's full of sand, and people usually die. When Maudo Prosperi took part in the 1994 Marathon des Sables through the Sahara Desert, known as the toughest race of its kind, he got lost and he just about died. In fact, Maudo got lost in the desert for 10 days. In the middle of the race, a sandstorm kicked up. He was blinded and he couldn't breathe. And when the storm died down, he had no idea where he was. Maudo wandered for quite some time, then found an old Muslim shrine in the middle of the desert, completely abandoned and falling apart. He took shelter inside the ruin and then fed himself by grabbing a handful of bats that he found roosting within the building, cutting their heads off, mushing up their innards with his knife, and then eating them raw. He literally sucked the insides out of about 20 bats so he could survive, and then he spent the rest of his time drinking his own urine. If it hadn't been for the ruins of that Muslim shrine in the middle of the desert, Maudo would have surely perished. He eventually gathered his senses and began to walk in the direction he thought would bring him to civilization. He stumbled upon an oasis, spotted some goats, and eventually found human people who rescued him after 10 days alone in the desert. Number 2. The survivor of 2 atomic bombs. Meet the man who survived 2 atomic bombs. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was in the middle of leaving Hiroshima when the bomb fell. He had been looking forward to going home to see his wife and his son when around 8 o'clock in the morning, the bomb fell on the city. At the time, he was less than 2 miles from ground zero. He survived with some pretty bad burns and his eardrums ruptured, but at least he was alive. He had to push through the ruined city and smoking carcasses just to reach the train station, which was full of burned and disoriented passengers. He then settled into the train for an overnight ride to his hometown of Nagasaki. You can probably gather the rest of the story from right here. According to History.com's amazing report about his life, Yamaguchi arrived in Nagasaki early in the morning and went to the hospital. Shortly afterwards, the second bomb was dropped. He literally fled one bomb just to get hit by the other. The atomic bomb that hit Nagasaki was more powerful than the one that hit Hiroshima. In fact, it was so strong that the shockwave blew Yamaguchi's bandages clean off his body. Miraculously, he came out the other end alive and continued living until 2010, when he passed away at the ripe old age of 93. Number 1. Struck by lightning. Getting struck by lightning is a very rare event. An even rarer event is when a man gets hit by lightning and survives. Ryan Cross became one of the luckiest people on Earth when he was struck by lightning near Idaho City on a weekend camping trip. He'd been hanging out with his friends, dirt biking and riding on their four-wheelers when a storm came out of nowhere. A bolt of lightning struck Ryan, giving him bleeding in his brain and really horrible burns down the front of his body. But somehow, he survived the incident. After he was struck, a friend managed to call OnStar and get help. He was whisked to the hospital where he eventually recovered. It's still quite a miracle. The lightning strike was so strong that it shredded the riding gear that Ryan had been wearing. How it didn't kill him is scientifically boggling, but he's definitely thankful to be alive. Who do you think out of all 10 people was the luckiest? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and don't forget to come back soon.